It all starts one day when Haoyi is chilling in class at school in Zitong. Out of nowhere, the hottest girl in school walks up to him and says she's pregnant with his baby. Haoyi's like, "What? I don't even know what this crazy girl is talking about," and refuses to pay child support. That makes the whole class mad, and before things get worse, he bolts. As word spreads across the school, he's trying to hide from the angry mob, but runs into Zitong again. He quickly tells her to meet him on the roof. He keeps running, but when he's out of breath, he grabs a mop and takes on the crowd, wiping them all out. Then he gets yanked into the girls' bathroom, where Tong, the captain of the girls' sports team, slaps him hard. She's heartbroken about the pregnancy rumors and threatens to crush him if he meets Zitong again. As they leave the bathroom, Ling shows up, begging Haoyi to come home to her and the kids. He's confused and asks, "Who the heck are you talking about?" She smacks him until Tong stops her, ready to fight for her man. A crowd gathers and Haoyi sees an opening to escape. He runs to the roof and threatens to jump if they don't back off. They think he's bluffing, but he's like, "Well, my life's a mess anyway, and let's go." But suddenly, time freezes, and a hot goddess named Mei shows up. She asks if he's the fool who ate Cupid's chocolates. That's when Haoyi remembers he shared a cake with a classroom full of girls and realizes he's completely screwed. Mei introduces herself as the goddess of love and congratulates him for finally getting some attention. Haoyi cusses her out for wrecking his peaceful life with these crazy girls. But she tells him he can break the magic if he fulfills their deepest desires. Then she bounces and time resumes. Haoyi keeps hiding from his accidental harem until he remembers Zitong might jump off the building too. So he runs back to the roof, finds her crying, and tells her to meet him late. The next day, he takes her to the hospital, and a bunch of nosy aunties call him scum for not using protection. While she sleeps, he's regretting everything and wishing he hadn't gotten involved. Later, a nurse shows him Zitong's test results, proving she's not pregnant. But Zitong hints they should try again. Instead, Haoyi offers to meet her parents, and she takes him home. When they pull up to a mansion, he realizes she's loaded and starts wondering how he'll fulfill her wish. A servant welcomes them, and Haoyi quickly says he's just a friend. The servant explains that Zitong's dad is never around, which actually makes Haoyi relieved. But another servant bursts in, claiming Haoyi knocked up Zitong, so she orders the men to beat him up for not using protection. Zitong begs the guards to stop, pulls him to her room, and Haoyi notices an old calendar revealing she's got daddy issues. He figures out what he needs to do, so he grabs the servant's phone and calls Zitong's dad, telling him to come over. When her dad arrives and sees Haoyi, he tells his men to beat him again. But Zitong shows him the hospital results, proving Haoyi's innocent. Her dad calls off the guards and asks what's going on. Haoyi confronts him, saying all Zitong wants is to have meals with him. This makes her dad rethink his life, and Haoyi uses the chance to run like crazy. As he catches his breath, Zitong finds him and is about to thank him with a sloppy kiss, but she disappears before he can even enjoy it. So out of nowhere, Mei shows up again and tells Haoyi the magic's been lifted. He's relieved, thinking he can finally go back to his boring life. But the next day, he trips and finds a missing poster with his face on it, made by his fake wife and kids, and realizes his life is still a complete mess. He sneaks into class where Zitong finds him and is still head over heels for him. Frustrated, he calls out for Mei, and when she appears, he demands to know why he's still dealing with this chaos. Mei explains that whatever feelings Zitong has now are real, and that the magic's off. She unfreezes time, and Haoyi reluctantly agrees to go out with Zitong. But before he can catch a break, knives start flying at him out of nowhere, and Shuli appears with a murderous vibe, furious about him cheating. When Haoyi tries to explain it's all a misunderstanding, Shuli shuts him up by shoving her tongue down his throat to make sure Zitong gets the message. Just as things are about to heat up, Zitong's mom shows up, dragging her daughter back to America. Later at school, Haoyi runs into Tong, who slaps him and breaks up with him on the spot. He fires back, telling her that her attitude won't help her find a man. Mei pops up again, and after hearing the story, Haoyi asks if breaking up with everyone would solve his problems. Mei just laughs and says he knows nothing about women before vanishing. Things get even weirder when Haoyi later finds Tong torturing the boys' sports team for losing a bet. He steps in to stop her, and surprisingly, this makes her a little excited. She storms off angrily, but the boys thank Haoyi for saving them. The next day, Haoyi wakes up late and finds Chuli lying in bed next to him, teasing him about missing a date. He denies it, but she locks him in his room. Desperate, he sneaks out through the neighbor's apartment. Meanwhile, Zitong is waiting for him, but starts doubting herself after remembering Shuli's intense kiss. She's about to end things with him when he finally shows up, and they sit down for drinks. Unfortunately, they have absolutely nothing to say to each other. To save them from drowning in awkward silence, Haoyi suggests they check out an anime festival nearby. While they're there, Shuelei, back at home, realizes he's gone and plans to hunt him down. At the festival, Haoyi and Zitong unexpectedly bump into Tang, who's working as a server for the fans. Tang panics when she spots her sports teammates in the distance, afraid they'll see her in such an embarrassing situation. She grabs Haoyi and Zitong and drags them away just as Shuli shows up at the venue with a huge sword. At the festival, Tang explains that when her teammates were new to the school, they got bullied because of their looks. She beat up the bullies to defend them, and now she's embarrassed to be seen working the fan service gig. Haoyi tells her to just be herself, which gives her some confidence. When the cosplay competition is announced, Tang needs 2 more people to participate, so Zitong volunteers both herself and Haoyi to help. Zitong, still annoyed, reminds Haoyi that he's probably the worst first date ever. After the festival, he takes her to the train station, but tells her he has something else to handle and leaves to meet Tong. When he catches up to her, he asks if she'd want to sleep with him sometime. She calls him a cultured man and runs off. Feeling like the magic's finally broken, Haoyi heads to an apartment where Miss Jai opens the door, surprised to see him after so long. As he walks through, he's puzzled at how she lives such an indecent life. Miss Jai asks him what he's doing there so late and wonders if it has something to do with Shuli. That's when Haoyi remembers that since elementary school, Shuli had been tormenting him because he always did better on his tests. To make her happy, he started failing on purpose, and it worked. But one day she tried to force him to go to America with her and made a bet that he'd have to come if she scored higher than him on their next exam. So he had to make sure the crazy BT went alone and ended up being the highest in the class, losing her the bet in the present. He tells Miss Ju that he'd need her help studying again, and she wonders what girl he's doing this for too. Meanwhile, Zetong reads a text from him and thinks he's so charming, just as he's about to get in on with Miss G, but she ends up passing out from being too drunk. He walks down the hall with Mehdi, who asks who Shu Ili was referring to earlier. So he tells her about Shu Ili's ex-boyfriend who fucked her up. But before he can get to the juicy details, 2 kids tackle him from behind, calling him daddy, as Ling appears behind them. When he asks who they are, she confirms they're his kids, and his soul begins to leave his body, until Mehdi drags it back to hell, and he's forced to promise the kids he'll come home that night, but makes them promise to call him uncle when they are outside. Afterward, he confronts Mehdi, and she explains that the main purpose of Cupid's contract is to help people fulfill their wishes. But if the contract is left unfulfilled for long, their wishes will come true. At the same time, Ling takes the kids to the front of the school, but receives a phone call requiring her immediate attention. So she tells them to wait for her till she returns, but immediately she leaves. Meng runs off and Hong chases after him. Later, she tells Haoye the kids are gone, and they agree to split up and look for them. Meanwhile, Zitong finds Hong and agrees to help her find her uncle, while Ming wrecks Halleck all over the school, eventually running into the girls' changing room. When Haoyi sees this, he tries to check if he's really in there, but Tang catches him peeping red-handed. As Zitong attends Hong, she hears some students mentioning Haoyili in another situation and wonders if she has poor taste in Mendez. Back at the changing room, Tang tells him it's only okay to be perverted toward her, not other girls asking him to apologize. But when Ming tries to come to his rescue, he pulls off her dress again, giving him a good view of heaven. Later, he finally returns the kids to Ling, and after she thanks him, he tries to remind her that they're only 20 years old and couldn't possibly have kids that are around 8 years old. But when she remains clueless, Mehdi appears and tells him that if this continues to go on, other people she interacts with will have their memories altered. So he follows her home and meets her crazy hot mother, who also remembers him as a deadbeat father. And when he enters, he notices they're kind of broke. Her mom leaves, and after putting the kids to bed, Ling tries to get him to make baby number 3. And just as he starts to get hard, his phone rings. When he hears Tong's voice, he immediately gets soft and agrees to go out with her on Sunday. But after he gets off the phone, Ling tells him they need some family bonding time on Sunday and should go to the same park. After realizing he's F, he wonders if he should pick between dumping a rich heiress or telling his kids he needs to buy milk. But he decides to pick his kids. However, when he calls Zitong to cancel the date, he changes his mind and plans to run both dates at the same time. The next Sunday, they get to the park at 9 a.m. and he plans to take them on as many rides as possible before he meets up with Zitong by 10. Even though he almost shot himself on every ride, he manages to spend the hour with his family and then runs across the park to meet Zitong. When she sees him, she tries to confess her feelings but is interrupted by a photographer who asks them if they'd like their pictures taken, so they agree, and she rubs her melons against him. Suddenly, the wind blows her hat off and he catches it for her, allowing her to plant one on him to show her appreciation. After he runs to the toilet, Meg appears and he asks her if the chocolate is somehow still affecting her. She tells him he's dense, so he runs off and tries to get some presents for the kids as they wait for him. But he runs into Dong, who tells him that Shirley's ex is back from America and tells him to take care of her. At the same time, he runs into Tang, and when his phone starts to ring, he asks her for a little favor. Afterward, Tang finds Zitong and explains that Haoyi asked her to keep her company while he does something important, so she asks if they were on a date, but Zitong denies this. Later on, Zitong and Tong continue their awkward date when they see Haoyi with Ling and the kids. But after he stays behind, they ambush him and tie his hands. And Tang calls him a scumbag for using her, so he explains that when he had been with Ling, he asked her about her father. And after he figured out that he never came back from buying milk, she got upset and refused to talk to him. Upon hearing this, the girls feel bad for her and let him off with a warning, allowing him to go to her. When he gets to her, he sees the photographer again and asks him to take their family picture. But when he realizes he's the same guy, he wonders how he's still single if this loser can juggle two baddies. Later, he walks Ling home, but she warns him not to bring her father up with her mom. So he decides to investigate other people she might have been close to. The next day, he heads to her elementary school. But everyone thinks he has the face of a pervert, so they try to hold him down. But when he escapes, he trips and falls onto a teacher's huge melons, proving them right. However, after hearing that he's looking for Ling's teacher, she sits down with him and tells him that her father suddenly disappeared after years of being a good dad, which wrecked Ling. With this information, he plans to find her father and heads to the police station where he meets Yan and asks him to help find her dad. So he leaves him to it and heads back home to find his parents looking sad, but they're unable to tell them what's going on. Suddenly, Shu Eli arrives and drags him to the bedroom, while his dad tells him it's time to test his game and wishes him luck in his room. Shu Eli tells him they should further the plot, but since he has a tiny sausage, he escapes and waits for her to fall asleep. Then Yan calls and informs him that he's found 20 possible numbers. So later he tries all the options but strikes out till he reaches the last. But when he calls, he gets no answer. Later that day, he calls again and finally gets a hold of Yuija, tells him he's his son-in-law and calls him out for being a shitty dadai. But then, he drops the bomb that Ling is not actually his daughter. This surprises him, so he heads to Ling's house just as she finishes an argument with her mom and runs off. But her mom also refuses to talk about him. Desperate for answers, he runs into an old woman who gives him all the tea, causing him to be depressed. When many ask what's got him down, he explains that Ling's mother had originally married a surgeon who ended up dying on duty, leaving her pregnant and alone. However, Yugia was willing to be a rebound Hennis offered to take care of her and her baby despite his parents' wishes. But after they nagged him hard enough, he divorced her and disappeared. After narrating the story, he says that he no longer wants to be involved with all of their bullshit and gives up. But when she tries to convince him there's still hope, he tells her to leave him alone. Then he heads home, but when he sees the family picture, he realizes he's being a dickhead and decides to try again. Later, as he continues to call Yuija, he asks Mei if the magic has dissipated since he hasn't been pestered by any new girls. But she tells him that the magic in an area works one case at a time. He then remembers he was supposed to meet up with Ling and the kids and heads to the school. After picking them up, they try to cross the street, but Ling accidentally steps in front of a moving truck. Afterward, an ambulance arrives and quickly rushes them to the hospital while Yuiji receives a phone call informing him that his daughter is in critical condition. He immediately rushes down while Tang and Zitong wait outside the surgery room and soon receive an update from the doctor. When Yuja finally arrives at the hospital, he tries to find Ling, but overhears a doctor saying that a young girl didn't make it, which leaves him devastated. But just as he begins to regret never bringing the milk home, Ling shows up behind him and jumps in his arms, saying the expired milk doesn't matter anymore. Meanwhile, Hao Di wakes up, and the last thing he remembers is pushing Ling out of the way and getting hit instead. As he fades in and out of consciousness, he sees his kids, and they say their final goodbyes since Ling's desire has been fulfilled. A month later, he's finally released from the hospital. Mei Yi relaxes after thinking her work with Hao Yidi is finally over. But she suddenly hears a commotion as another Hao Yi obsessed crackhead is about to jump off the building and eventually ends up in the hospital. While she enjoys her break, she sees a couple having an argument and tries to use her magic to help them make up, but it backfires horribly, making them split up instead. Afterward, each girl tries to visit Hao Yi, but finds their competition there also, and as they argue about who is more important to him, Ling reminds them that he literally jumped in front of a truck for her, winning her the round. After they barge into his apartment but find him taking back shots from doing when he's left alone, Many show up and complain that she's still a loser like him who can't get her magic right. But Shu Ilai manages to hear her voice and barges in to see who he's talking to. As the other girls come in, Shu Ilai spots a part of Mei's dress, so Mei freezes time, since that's not supposed to be possible. But as she tries to undo her mistake, she accidentally gives Haoyi a free OnlyFans subscription. Later, she tells him her powers must be malfunctioning because he hasn't solved all the problems of the girls who ate the cake. But as he's about to leave her to her mess, he hears Sandy on the table calling out for him. Suddenly, he gets transported to a strange place where Sandy appears. And when he wonders how the F that's possible, Mei explains that the chocolates must be making her imagination real. Then Sandy tells him to follow her to a fancy world, and when he takes her hand, she flies off with him. However, Meggie warns him that if he continues to indulge her, she'll lead him to another dimension, so he tries to stall for time by getting ice cream, but when she thinks she sees a jellyfish, she transports them to an aquarium. As they watch the dolphins from afar, she plans to take them with her too, but he tells her she's being a selfish brat, which makes her sad, and her magic begins to break apart. So he tells her they can go to her fancy world the next day. Later, Mei tells him that Sandy's actually in a hospital, and he's been talking to her spirit the whole time. So if lets her go to her fancy world, her real body would die. So he says he'd use his time to find a way to convince her to stay. Afterward, he finds Sandy at the portal and tries to convince her to stay, but she refuses and runs into the portal. So he chases after her and finds that her fancy world has become dark and lifeless. So he takes her hand and shows her a recap of the anime, explaining that all the other girls have found hope thanks to the goddess of love, and she can too if she comes with him. So she agrees, but he tells her she needs to answer some questions first. Afterward, he uses the help of Ling Zhitong and Tang to create a massive awareness of Sandy and her mistreatment by her agency. Then he tracks down her childhood friend Ji, who tells him that since he grew up with Sandy and was the only one she would ever listen to, her agency ended up paying him to pretend to be her friend while keeping her away from interacting with anyone else, leaving her in a permanent childlike state. However, after 10 years of keeping up the act, he was tired of constantly babysitting her and wanted a life of his own, which she overheard. Meanwhile, Zaitong hopes Haoyi will reward her for her help. Sees a reminder of her grandfather's birthday, which she's dreading. Then she hears on the news that Sandy has finally woken up from her coma and is requesting for Haoyi to meet her. Later, Haoyi tries to enter the hospital, but it's swarming with paparazzi who are on the lookout for him. So Betty helps him with disguise, and he's able to sneak into her room. There, he introduces her to Mehdi, who transports them all over the world to have a fun-filled day. Later, Sandy announces that she'll be going abroad to study, but will hold a solo concert before then to show her appreciation for those who gave her their support. On the day of the concert, she visits Sandy and apologizes for how things played out, but she tells him that they've both been suffering for the last 10 years and should try to be real friends again, and he agrees. So the concert begins, and she presents her Cupid's chocolate-inspired song. But while she performs, she heads to her Haoyi is sitting and whispers of thank you in his ears. Unfortunately for him, the audience goes crazy and takes pictures of them, which makes the news. The next morning, he hides in the bushes as he remembers how he had been chased by a mob after the concert and almost murdered by Xutali, and now has no place to go. Then Ji walks by, and after asking for her help, she takes him to a discreet location where he can finally get some rest. But when he wakes up, he sees a mysterious man in front of him who tells him Jia already ditched his ass. While they talk, Zitong calls to make sure he's okay, and he tells her where he is. So the man asks if she's his girlfriend, but when Haoyi denies it, he offers him a magic candy box. After Zaitan arrives, he finds that the man has disappeared just as Mehdi watches from outside. Then the man appears in front of her, and she recognizes him as Director Rias. So he tells her she'd be stripped of all her powers overnight for revealing herself to a mortal. But when she begs him to help her, he agrees and uses his magic to give her a patch to help control her magic, warning her not to intervene with the mortals again or she'll lose her magic. Meanwhile, Haoyi watches as Sandy clears up the rumors of him being her boyfriend. Later, they get ambushed by a group of guys. He decides to show his strength and wipe the floor with them as Zitong calls the police. When the police arrive, they arrest the guys. And when she explains that she didn't know he wasn't completely a weak loser, he tells her that Haoyi's father is actually the chief of police, but this makes him sad and he walks off. So she chases after him and tries to ask questions. But he tells her to drop it and hands her a drink as a mysterious man watches from a tree. Later, he decides to open up and tells her that when he was a kid, he wanted to be a policeman too and studied hard to be at the top of his class. But his parents always neglected him, even on his birthdays. During an incident when he was 11, some men tried to break in and end him. And when he called the police for help, he expected that his dad would rush over, but he sent a colleague instead. After the incident, they moved to a new neighborhood where he met Nat. After hearing this, Zaitong feels sad for him and embraces him while Mehde watches. And as she flies off, she cries and realizes that she's caught feelings for him too. Then Crow, who clearly has a thing for her, shows up and begs her to follow him back to their world. But she refuses, claiming that she has to find the girl who left the chocolate on the roof in the first place. Later, Haoyi relaxes in his room when he receives a call from Zitong, who says Tong needs their help. 2 hours ago, Zitong had met up with her at another anime festival and met her new teammates. But she suddenly realized that she had forgotten her crown in school. So as she left to get it, it started raining, leaving her stuck at the bus stop. So Haoyi sprints to the school to get her crown, but runs into Mi, who is heartbroken that he's in love with Zitong. She fixes up and decides to help him. So he reaches Tong at the bus stop with an umbrella and carries her to the event so she can make it on time. And just when the crowd gets bored of Zitong's face, Tang finally shows up and pleases the crowd. Afterward, she thanks Zaitong for helping her, but begins to feel like a third wheel when both of them ignore her existence to flirt. Later, Mei Yi flies around his room while he receives a couple of packages she ordered and reminds him that his school is going camping. The next day, as Haoyi prepares for the trip, Zaitong asks him to write his name for the draw, but she gives him a marked paper that she and Tong prepared so they would end up on the same team. There are 3 ways. However, Ling overhears their plan and also marks her paper with the same color, forcing Tom to choose all 3 as her teammates. So they hike through the forest while Haoyi lags behind from carrying so much weight and tells Mei to get her fat ass off him, so she leaves to do some exploring. Later, they reach their campsite, and as they set up, Ling and Saitong both make him dinner, and Tong tells him to choose which to eat. But before he can choose, he gets a call from Ju. Like tells him she's coming to join them, and immediately lands in their camp. When she sees the other 3 girls, she asks him why he's spending time with them, and tosses their dinner to the floor, which makes Tong mad as she tells her off. So Shu Eli tries to end her and starts to chase her around camp, and she accidentally sets their stuff on fire. So Zitong rushes to get water to put it out, but ends up falling in the river. And when Tong tries to save her, she gets pulled in too, so he rushes to help them. But when Shu Li tries to stop him, Ling Fei slaps her and warns her that Haoyi will end up hating her if she doesn't get her ST together. Then she pulls out a map and shows her where they're likely to get out of the river, and suggests they meet up with them there. Meanwhile, Haoyi runs along the river, wondering where Mei is when he needs her, but she's stuck on the other side of the forest since she has lost her magic. So Tang and Zitong begin to sink below the surface, but he jumps in and gets them to a nearby rock. When they are unable to hold on, he tells them to hold onto his legs instead. At the same time, Ling and Shu Eli make their way through the forest, and she cries over how useless she is, but Ling tells her to get over it and change if she doesn't want him to drop her dead weight. Meanwhile, Haoyi manages to get the girls to safety, and they warm up by the fire till Ling and Zuli finally find them. So they continue to warm up as Mei Yu watches and wonders if Haoyi needs her anymore while the girls argue over who gets to sleep with him, but he suggests that they all sleep together instead. The next morning, Xueli tries to do it with Hao Yue again. Bitang stops her, and they start their usual fight till Zitong's dress gets ripped from trying to separate them, so he tells them to knock it off. But suddenly Ling faints and they realize she needs immediate medical attention. By a stroke of luck, Shu Eli's mom arrives, and after Shu Eli explains the situation, they carry Ling on their helicopter, while she tells him that a car will come by to pick the rest of them up. When they leave, he notices that Zitong is exposed and begins to take off his clothes. In another perverted move later, he prepares for Zitong's arrival since she wants to return his clothes. And when he hears a knock, he opens the door but finds Dong there and tells him now's not the time for a sneaky link. But Dong refuses to leave and asks him if he's decided to accept Suli, as he'd want to pursue her himself if Hao Yi is not interested. But when Hao Yi says he hasn't decided, Dong gives him hell for stringing her along, as well as Zitong. Just then, Su Tang arrives to hear this. So Dong leaves and she asks Hao Yi what exactly happened between him and Zhu Li. So he tells her that after he started failing tests on purpose for her, they started to grow apart. But Dong, who was clearly in love with her, managed to keep them close together until Kuli started dating his senior Yusei and pretending Hao Yi didn't exist. However, on the night of their school dance, Yuz announced that he was engaged to another girl in front of Tex Yuli and publicly disgraced her. So she ended up dropping out of school, so went to visit her and cheer her up. But when he got there, she stuck her tongue down his throat and asked him to never leave her. making her into the crazy bitch she is today. After the story, Zaitong asks if he's sure he's not in love with Zuli, but he assures her that once he deals with Yuz, he'll inform her of their relationship. Later, she runs into him again, and though she tries to avoid him, he follows her and says he needs her to convince her mom to support his business. Old time's sake. When she returns home, she tries to hide herself away in fear, but remembers Ling's words of encouragement. So when he calls again, she tells him to go F himself, but he threatens to harm Haoyi instead. After he gets Haoyi to meet him in a parking lot where there's no service. So when Zuli tries to reach him, she's unsuccessful and rushes out to save him. However, Mai happens to be flying nearby and notices her getting kidnapped. So she finds Haoyi and tells him about this, while Yuz threatens to send nudes of Zitan to her mother to blackmail her into working with. At the same time, Mei Yi leads Haoya to the hideout spot, and he asks her to record what's about to happen so they can have solid evidence to give to the police. So he breaks in and tells Yuz to let her go. But when he threatens to hurt her, Huri has no choice but to get whooped yet again in his own anime. However, when Zuli sees that he's about to get seriously hurt, she steps in to protect him as she remembers how things got this complicated when they were kids. She liked Kaoyi, but her mom fucked up her chances by telling her she needed to be better than him at everything. However, her plan backfired as it caused him to pull away. So on Valentine's Day, she tried to give him some chocolates, but no one would believe that she would like such a loser, and instead of telling the truth, she played along and gifted them to Yuz instead. Upon hearing this, Yuz confesses that he always knew she liked Haoyi and decided to make her pay since he felt so humiliated. But Haoyi interrupts and apologizes for also being so passive over the years. Then he signals to Mei to upload the video, which they also receive on their phones. Then Haoyi takes them out and the police arrive to take them away. But in a last-ditch effort, Hughes tries to stab Haoyi, but Julie jumps in the way and gets stabbed instead. Later at the hospital, Zedong tries to comfort him, but he brushes her off, saying she wouldn't understand. Then Zuli's mom shows up and slaps him, blaming him for Izuli's state. But her dad soon comes to get her and apologizes, explaining that crazy runs in the family. Afterward, she wakes up and they go to see how she's doing. But she can't remember who Haoye is, so her parents leave the room and he reminds her who he is and promises to protect her forever. Then she stops the act and tells him he's got to keep his promise, while the other girls barge in and tell her that's cheating. Suddenly, a girl walks up behind them and clings to Haoyi, claiming that he belongs to her instead. And when the girls complain that their harem is full enough, he explains that she's his cousin Shiotu, and they head home together. There, he hands her the pajamas Zetong picked out, but they end up being too PGD-18. So she jumps on him and asks him to give it to her, but he tells her when she's older and tucks her in bed. The next day, Sandy comes to check on him after hearing about the last incident, but when he realizes that the paparazzi will continue to stalk his house because of her, he cross-dresses again. They leave thinking she's just visiting a female friend at school. The girls notice that Haoyi is tired and wonder what he did last night, so Shutu taunts them, claiming they made love all night. This angers Tang and she demands that he explain himself, and when the other girls back her up, he refuses to explain and tells them to mind their business and leaves. Later, Shed-Tong asks Shuji to meet with her and tell her more about his problems with his parents so she can find a way to help him, but she tells her to back off and reveals that she is Haoyi's first ever girlfriend. After this, Sitong reports to the girls and they can't believe their ears, but she suggests that they ask Dong about it, and he also confirms the statement. So, as the girls try to figure out what to do, Jihu approaches them and explains that she's not actually an obnoxious bitch, and explains how it all started when they were kids. She had gone to visit him right after the attempted kidnapping incident, and he had given up on his dreams of being a policeman because his father didn't care whether he lived or died and cared only about his job. After realizing he was in a lot of pain, she stuck by his side, played the role of his girlfriend in a school play when no one else wanted to partner with him, and also got Dong to become friends with him. So she tells him that she only wanted to make sure that the girls were truly his friends and asks for their forgiveness. Later, Zitong shows up at his place and tells him Chiotu is trying to leave without saying goodbye. So they rush to the airport, but when they realize she'd already be on the plane, they tell the driver to take a shortcut, while the other girls help clear his path, and Meidi uses her magic so she can hear him. Then he's finally able to thank her for all she's done for him and tell her goodbye. After she leaves, the girls go back to their usual bickering.